Starfield is our first new universe in over 25 years, but it's still a Bethesda RPG through and through.
The Xbox showcase came and went over the past weekend, but Starfield had the biggest presence. Of all the unknown questions across the galaxy, one remains larger than all others. Why 30? So the first point to make is only the developers themselves know the reasons why 30 FPS is the limit, but here I will use information from the team, previous games and educated assumptions to kind of fill in the blanks. To better understand the reasons for this choice, yes, plural, as it's rarely a single reason for decisions during development, and usually a collection or compound of them, we need to look at many aspects of the game and the engine which it is built upon, the creation engine in its second generation. That was first used in Skyrim and then upgraded in many areas over that in Fallout 4, Fallout 76, and now augmented far more with Starfield. As we discussed in our prior preview last year, much of the tech evolution additions and comparisons to the previous game were all covered in detail then. It's still relevant and validated from this latest showing, so go and check that out to learn more. As discussed then, the game utilises a deferred render or deferred shading for its many lights and physically based materials. At a high level, a deferred renderer allows almost limitless levels of lights, within reason, and improved light reactions on surfaces over a more traditional forward render, something physically based materials require to achieve more approximate levels of accuracy. Now, like all things in engineering and certainly software though, a deferred render comes with pros and cons. The ability to increase both lighting quantity and accuracy is a clear plus. However, one huge con is the impact it has on CPU and GPU rendering time, and a significant impact on memory and bandwidth. Simply put, the game must create two passes as a minimum of each per frame. One is for all the geometry in the scene, called the G buffers, and the second is the shading or lighting pass. This will then evaluate all the lights and materials per object, and this is per pixel. The cost is cheaper for many lights as it only updates the areas of the frame that are impacted by lights, hence why it's deferred. But the downsides are anti-aliasing and transparencies are much harder or not even possible. More memory is needed to store all the various buffers from geometry, depth, light, colors, etc. And this can add a great deal of cost in stages of the pipeline, potentially doubling or even tripling the render cost over a forward rendering method. Now, I cannot go into the depth of it here, and there are many options and caveats available, and other methods even, but fundamentally the CPU and GPU will have more to process, multiple textures will be sampled, increasing bandwidth, and the BRDFs required for PBR materials need more care in a deferred render, but ultimately render time could be much higher over a forward render, such as what Doom Eternal uses. Compounding this cost further is the significantly improved lighting and material quality. The more layers you add for specular diffuse and irradiance, which the team have here with a full real-time global illumination system, then all these areas increase exponentially. Not to mention the higher the resolution output you target, being 4K here on the Series X, then this can become an even greater cost. And in fact, we see this borne out in the PC specs, with both the recommended and minimum specifications requiring 16 GB of system RAM. Not to mention what settings or outputs these two specs will get you, but my assumption is the recommended levels are the Series X and the minimum levels are somewhere around the Series S. Although the GPU and even the CPU options do raise my eyebrows a little, as the RX 6800 XT and 2080 are certainly not in the same range of performance, and even the 5600X is arguably below the Series X CPU in a closed box console architecture. But we'll know more once the game actually launches and we can go hands-on.
Ryujin is hiring the best and brightest of today for our future tomorrow.
So we can look back at some older games on the PC. Let's start with Skyrim. On the Series X, even running it at 4K with the older Enhanced Edition in backwards compatibility mode, which is not optimized for the Series X hardware, the game can still drop frames significantly at certain points under that 60 FPS target. By utilising PC, we can dig a little deeper onto what is causing the performance dips on Series X. 4K 60 with reduced bandwidth at base clocks on my RTX 2070, we have just over 435 GB per second and just over 8 teraflops of performance. In a similar scene with dense volumetric fog, alpha and geometry, we are dipping into the high 40s, but if we bump the GPU memory by almost 6% to 460 GB per second, we can see a big increase in both highs and lows, on average almost 12% faster now, showing that in this scene at least we are bandwidth bound and thus the GPU is waiting on work for some part of the frame. By boosting bandwidth, we improve GPU utilization, but that's not to say it's not also ALU bound. If we increase the core clock by 10%, we gain a further 5% on top of that, meaning in this sequence, we are borderline bandwidth and then ALU bound. The combined memory and core clock increase gives us 18% in total, meaning bandwidth is the most likely culprit here, but it's not a surprise due to those 4K buffers and deferred rendering base I just covered. Now, Fallout 4 shows a similar scenario at 4K, although it's far more ALU bound now than bandwidth, showing the team likely improved areas of bandwidth limitations in their engine between the two games, and also the engine, or maybe even the team, scale assets with resolution, and as I mentioned in the previous section, this ramps up demands on memory and bandwidth, and we can see that in the increased assets here that now support a level of PBR based materials, and the system and VRAM demands can then creep up over Skyrim. Now, performing a similar test in Fallout 4, again 4K 60, we can see bumping bandwidth up by approximately 6% does nothing, but bumping core clocks, which includes cache and ALU, by 12% gains us almost double that. The same boosted core paired with slower memory though still shows a 4 to 5% decrease, again highlighting the engine is well balanced, but the faster the GPU, the more bandwidth will play a role. Now recall that the Series X has 560 GB per second bandwidth for the first 10 GB of its GDDR6 RAM, but the second 6 GB only has 336 GB, and this split pool, which can be used for GPU and CPU tasks, is accessed by the same bus, whereas on PC, that discrete GPU at least, all that bandwidth is dedicated to the GPU. Now, reinforcing this is the fact that Fallout 4 in its backwards compatibility mode on Series X only has a 4K 30 option or a 1080p 60 option. Now, almost certainly the Series X at 4K 60 would also struggle in denser areas. To reinforce this, we can see on a PC the RTX 2070 overclocked to maximum levels at a reduced rate of 1620p still struggles to hold a locked 60 FPS and can dip into the high 40s. Now, although the game is not optimized for the Series X, and this is just example territory, it does show that even Fallout 4 can become ALU and bandwidth bound due to the heavy demands the engine places on the hardware and the higher quality assets at 4K, which will be drastically increased in Starfield both in quality, quantity and resolution, means that this is not going to get easier for the Series X or PC, and we've not even mentioned the CPU yet.
Come on. Okay, take it easy. You were out cold. No physical damage. Mentally, the jury's still out.
Now, continuing our dive into the engine and setting expectations and reasons for that 30 FPS target on consoles, we see another potential issue, and one where the team certainly have improved. In Skyrim, the game was very dependent on a main worker thread, likely a rendering thread kicking off all the jobs, and this didn't use CPU utilization very well. And in fact, even here at 60 FPS on my aging 2700 CPU at 3.8 GHz, it can get close to maxing out one single thread, meaning above this it would likely become CPU bound very often. Now, some of this is DirectX API related, and DX12 is much better at CPU utilization, but the team also made significant strides from Skyrim to Fallout, improving the balance of CPU work across multiple threads, approximately 7 to 8, but 2 main worker threads still take the majority of the work, often around 50 to 60% utilization, meaning even above 60 FPS it can become CPU bound. Starfield is likely going to increase the strain significantly on the CPU by adding a wealth of new features both in-game and rendering. A better CPU than this seems likely for 60 FPS. My aging 2700 will certainly not cut it most likely. But this is not what we find inside the Series X and even the Series S, being significantly better. The game offers a wealth of updates to the previous titles and game engine, much better and higher quality physically based materials, full real-time global illumination, a new animation system that now relies on physics and inverse kinematics.
That one's a lot of fun.
Improved AI.
Is it really you?
And another big area, procedural world and quest creation.
I think what's cool about this whole system that we generate the planet itself as a procedural content, but the handcrafted content itself comes as the player explore.
Now, much of this is building on the Radiant AI and quest system in the previous titles, but the procedural generation is a significant improvement and impact on the game engine and solutions in the title. This explains why they rely and require a real-time lighting solution with global illumination, as it's likely creating a cube map snapshot of the player's position every n amount of frames during play, most likely every second or third. This can then be used for reflections, with no SSR being used here, and instead projected dynamic cube maps are used, as you see here, with no reflections of people on the table, but in metallic objects you can see the world is moving as the camera does, albeit slower than that 30 FPS render rate. This same cube map can also be used for image-based lighting, a pass within its deferred rendering, and by sampling the sun and moon position and a low proxy of nearby objects and their relevant albedo color, they can factor in a level of bounce, which we see in some of these shots here. This is significantly improved over the previous title, and a cube map is basically a panoramic picture that you wrap into a globe or a cube, hence the name, and then use that to bounce and sample off within the world on multiple surfaces. It is actually a great economy of scale benefit from those dynamic cube map process, killing two birds with one stone effectively, and in reality it's likely used even more during the frame. Now this is vital as the game procedurally generates all of the planets. The team could not generate any baked lights or assets at all, as it will be unique per player per discovery, and as such a real-time solution is required, just as we saw in No Man's Sky, which uses a similar procedural generation technique, albeit with much lower density assets and worlds. But yet again, this adds more to the engine render loop. If we take that into account, the game is likely doubling, potentially even more, of its CPU work based on previous titles. Real-time collision and physics are definitely there, as the team demonstrated that quite clearly in all of the combat punching explosions, all causing real ragdoll and explosion and physics-based simulation, which adds additional pressure on both the CPU and memory.
We do love stuff and all of the items allowing you to pick everything up, and you can view all that in your data menu. We love to pack a ton of detail in every object, from all of your weapons, to spacesuits, to food. We just obsess over the details, and food. We obsess over food.
Now, the team are masters of iteration and building upon their previous technologies and games. All of their games had, relative to their peers at least, a high level of physicality and geometric detail. Starfield has continued this trend by increasing world density and clutter, from the new hype map ground terrain that likely also uses adaptive tessellation across the world, increases that organic nature of rock formations, rugged rock faces, and other areas of the planets within. Complementing this is a drastic increase in object detail and triangle count, from characters, dialogue-driven procedural animation, which includes increased bone rigs and emotional expression. This level of micro and macro detail scales up from the sandwiches between battles, the weapons you can build and customize, to the very spaceships that can be upgraded and augmented, culminating in you using them to travel to planets you can explore, harvest, or just drop in for some wet work. Even comparing to the showing last year, we've seen other areas of improvement. The cascaded shadow maps have been improved in quality. They can still shift between cascades close to the camera, but they have improved the temporal noise filter and TAA pass on them. Now, in addition, the skin shading, including some subsurface scattering and tone mapping, has been improved, although Time of day is always a factor here in things looking different, but generally these are now more accurate on fleshy hands and faces. Alongside the improved shadows, they've added in screen space shadows now, as you see here on the watch, that was not present in last year's gameplay reveal. These, alongside screen space ambient occlusion, which was present already in the engine, do go a long way to improve the solidity of characters in the game, but also the long vistas into the distance where shadow maps would fail due to resolution requirements. The use of fog volumes, billboard sprites, bloom and lens flare all add significantly to the filmic look the game has, mixing up many styles with clear Alien, Dune, Total Recall, Blade Runner, Starship Troopers and other science fiction movie staples, and this is not even getting into other areas of the title, including per object and camera motion blur, which has been added into the game and engine with the help of id Tech. All this leaves Starfield clearly the best looking game Bethesda has ever made, by a long chalk. There are still areas that could be improved. The over-reliance on dynamic cube maps and therefore the impact that has on lighting and shadow means there are some incorrect light bleed and bad lighting, glowing areas and lack of occlusion in many others that can look quite gamey at certain points. Yes, ray trace lighting might improve that, but also we have to take into account this is a very data and dynamic driven game, and they always have been very focused on that area, and they certainly haven't dulled that down in Starfield. So with some of the main points covered in the engine itself, the previous games, and only a small selection of updates and new demands the team have now added, can we finally answer the question of why 30 FPS then? Well, following the interview with Todd and Ryan right after the showcase, which you can check out on our IGN channel right here, Todd had this to say on the 30 FPS cap.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I think it'll come as no surprise given our previous games. What we go for are always these huge open worlds, fully dynamic, hyper detail where anything can happen. It's 4K in the X, it's 1440 on the S. We do lock it at 30. Because we want that fidelity, we want all that stuff, we don't want to sacrifice any of it. Fortunately in this one, we've got it running great, it's often running way above that, sometimes it's 60. But on the consoles, we do lock it because we prefer the consistency. Yeah. Right, you're not even thinking about it, and we don't ever want to sacrifice that experience that makes our games, really, really special.
And Todd is correct. All games and entertainment medium should be the creator's choice and vision. I know many want to boil these things down to a single answer as to why, and if that is all you want, then the answer, as Todd stated, is correct. They wanted as little compromise on that vision as possible, and 30 FPS allows them that. Now, as I've covered throughout this video though, the reasons for this are likely not singular or just CPU or GPU, as is often the discourse online. Hardware, software development is far more than that, and hopefully I've demonstrated some of those nuanced issues here. The game is likely limited in many areas depending on the dynamic nature of it, and I'm sure in many areas, such as space battles, travel, exploration, and even battles in the ground, it can hit 60 FPS on Series X. But in many other areas it could fluctuate wildly between 16 and 33 milliseconds and maybe even higher frame times, which will feel bad to play and certainly inconsistent. By capping to 30 FPS, this gives the game engine a fixed amount of headroom in most areas to remain within that 33 millisecond time as 30 FPS requires. The game is likely double buffered, and this gives them 2 frames in flight, which will eat into any other memory beyond that point and cause other issues. Now, the areas on this will fluctuate all the time on what is causing performance issues. It could be bandwidth, it could be CPU, cache, data, ROPS, and many, many more. Even in this demo, we can see some drops to 20 FPS in brief battles as here, which look to be bandwidth and or fill rate limited and thus become memory bound. This is most likely not a CPU issue and is purely a GPU in quotes related one. But in the dense cities with mass NPCs all going about their business and those extra cycles spent on tracking and updating all that, we may see CPU demands raise significantly, and that will then become the bottleneck for the game. As the game targets 4K based on the press release and as Todd said himself, but looking at the game and making some counts, I get lower than that. The game still loads from exteriors to interiors, as I surmised in last year's preview, and that is shown here in gameplay, although they're almost instantaneous based on this video. But this is one area the SSD of the consoles is making a big difference, in addition to that procedural world creation and streaming, allowing assets to be of much higher density. But the rendering of the interiors does appear to run with a higher resolution, and maybe other rendering changes. In here, I can get counts as high as approximately 1620p, with what looks like a reconstruction technique back to 4K. Now, it's possibly FSR2, but it's too early to make a call on that. But in exteriors, I did get counts down to as low as 1271p. Now, these are all approximate, but this could be a dynamic scaling solution between FSR2 levels, which can go as low as 1080p, and maybe even higher and lower. But based on that, plus the aspects I've covered already in previous titles on PC and Series X in this very video, I would imagine we have a title that can again, in places, place heavy demands on the hardware across the full spectrum, meaning the core game the team wants to create would be heavily sacrificed if they had to reduce core areas of the engine, such as that GI solution, the AI, the animation, the materials, the physics, the weather, the procedural worlds and quests. And none of these will be solved by simply dropping resolution. Modern engines can scale, of course, but within reason. And as this game is both a deferred renderer as a base, its data-driven worlds, interactions and combat, more of these areas cannot simply be dialed back without significant work or sacrifices to that original vision, or both. Now, once we get hands-on, you can be sure we will get you all these answers and more. But from this side of the fence, I would assume the game is best played at 30 FPS due to multiple elements the team have discovered within their tests, and do expect that to translate over to the PC space as well, per the specifications and tests detailed here. But really, none of this should come as a huge surprise, and I think the only remaining concern I have is if the areas of sub 30 FPS shown here can be resolved come September, or at the very least they are very rare across the normal course of play. And for the answers to that, and all your gaming, technology, performance and space related sandwich munching, keep it IGN Performance Reviews, and we'll see you in the final frontier come September. But for now, I'll leave the final word with Todd and those blue eyes.
On behalf of all of us, we can't wait for you to play Starfield and make your own special moments.
Go. Good luck, Constellation. You are